So let's begin. I'm Scott Sagan, the director here at CSAC, and it's a real pleasure to have Reed Chervin speaking with us today. Dr. Chervin is associate professor and associate director of the Madhwani Shaheda Institute for American Studies at OP Jindal University, north of Delhi. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow in strategy and policy department at the U.S. Naval War College, and his first book, Cold War in the Himalayas, was published by Amsterdam University Press. He'll be talking today, as you see, on foreign support for the Tibetan refugees during the Cold War, which he has been writing and researching while he's been in India this past year. I'll turn it over to you, speak for 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments from the audience. And for those of you online, if you want to post your question in the comments, I'll be able to call and read out your questions if possible. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Yeah,
thanks
very much. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. I hope this can be the beginning of sort of a long-standing connection between Jindal and Stanford. Professor Shumat Ganguly was at Jindal recently, and again, it's good to maintain these ties when U.S.-India relations are a little bit fraught. Again, as Scott mentioned, this is my current book project, and I think let's see. Okay, just kind of connecting this topic with current affairs, refugees are very much in the news these days. I'm sure a lot of you recognize some of these images. The upper left are the Rohingya people who have fled persecution in Myanmar to namely Bangladesh. Refugee camp depicted there. Ukrainians, of course, with the conflict ongoing and ending up in places like Poland and other locales. And then the image here being Afghani refugees who have fled that country mainly in terms of this picture after the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. So unfortunately, this whole idea of refugee crises is not a dead topic, but I think there are a lot of parallels with what happened to the Tibetans in the 1950s through the 1970s. And I'll connect that a little bit with their situation today. I'm sorry. The sort of central question or series of questions I ask, which I deem my book puzzle, is the following. So to what extent and how did governments, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, and for that matter, individuals support Tibetan refugees? And also, how did China respond to this type of assistance? There was a lot of overlap between these different groups, coordination in terms of their aid efforts. Different organizations in the United States, for example, received a significant amount of their funding from the State Department, the Refugee Office specifically. And what I'll go into later is a lot of the individuals involved with this had sort of common bonds in terms of being, for example, members of the China lobby opposing communism, and the Tibetans being a convenient way of supporting that, supporting and furthering those efforts, rather. And what Lydia Walker, who is a scholar who's worked on this topic recently, has pointed out is that this situation of the Tibetan refugees produced very unusual alliances, in the sense that, of course, there were these anti-communist groups and elements. Then there were also organizations that were in support of persecuted religious minorities, and so on and so forth. So looking into these unusual alliances between groups that may not have worked together at all and may have, in fact, opposed one another, I think is quite interesting. So I'm a historian by training, as Scott alluded to, and I'm very empirical in my approach. So I guess I would be a self-described archive rat. I've been to probably 35 archives over the course of my career, and one of which I've been using the last few days has been here at Stanford, the Hoover Library, which has been a fantastic resource. So I've incorporated some of those findings into this talk. That's right. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Pay homage to my hosts. So, anyway, I've looked at, in terms of this time, the periodization, basically going from the 1950s through the early 1970s. So I've been to some of the presidential libraries, again, very convenient for my previous incarnation being at the Naval War College and being able to go up to Boston, use the materials at the JFK Library and at Harvard. Also, one thing that was a bit of a surprise to me, and of course I'll go into more detail about, is Canada played a fairly large role in supporting the Tibetan refugees. So was up at Ottawa dealing with the National Archives there. Similarly, I haven't been, but was able to procure online sources through the Australian Archives. And again, one of the other themes I'll talk about in this is that of Commonwealth solidarity, supporting India and the underlying reasons for that. Then also got some materials through the Swiss Federal Archives. Again, haven't been in person, but very good online resources. Switzerland with their sort of humanitarian tradition and the Red Cross being based there produced a lot of important material. And again, I'll return to this in a bit, but I was able to pay a visit to Dharamshala a couple of months ago, and unfortunately, their Library of Tibetan Works was not extremely useful for me personally, but did point me to some secondary works that yielded some fruit. In terms of stuff going forward, I would, if funding and time allows, would like to go to the National Archives at the UK, a good archive just in general, but looking at British connections to Tibet that go back quite a long ways, actually. You could say at least to the Young Huntsman's mission in the 19th century. And then also, of course, now that I'm living in India, going to what was formerly known as the Nehru Library would make a lot of sense. One of the figures that I won't talk about today, but was very active in this refugee aid effort from the Indian side was Kripalani, one of the members of parliament who was very sympathetic to the Tibetan cause and was the chairman of the, I believe it was the Central Relief Committee for the Tibetans. And again, in terms of methodologies beyond just using archival sources as a research approach, I'm someone who, in my previous work, and I think in this current project, am trying to deal with sort of a longstanding criticism of diplomatic history that it's too elitist, just looking at the views, or mainly looking at the views of policymakers and other elites, and instead trying to look at the views of ordinary people. Here at the archives at Hoover, there are many letters from people described as concerned housewives who were trying to figure out how to donate to help the Tibetans, and again, how people from all walks of life became involved in this movement. And also, as I mentioned, some of these unifying thematic concepts such as anti-communism, again, supporting religious minorities, humanitarianism, of course, being perhaps the largest and most significant one. But then also concepts such as anti-imperialism, again opposing Chinese colonial rule over Tibet and things like that. And then again looking at these transnational processes from different multinational perspectives. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but just some of the recent work I mentioned a second ago. Lydia Walker, who published this article in the American Historical Review, relying mainly on sources from the Hoover, the American Emergency Committee for Tibetans, which again I will discuss in a lot more detail. This recent book about Switzerland's role in the Cold War and how they navigated the sort of difficult environment dealing with China's diplomatic presence in Europe, and at the same time aiding the Tibetans. And then again, this recent work dealing with Tibetan exiles in India. So I think for one reason or another, this is sort of a popular topic, it seems, and I'm trying to kind of ride that wave, so to speak. So again, why this topic? So I think one of the reasons, again, is that Tibet is in the news. The Dalai Lama turned 90 last year, and there's a lot of discussion of succession, in terms of what that will mean for the Tibetan exile community, what will it mean for people in Tibet. That's certainly on a lot of people's minds. Over the last few decades, China has been involved in so-called development in Tibet. Question of what that means in terms of Tibetans' way of life, cultural protection, and so forth. All sorts of frankly, environmental issues that are going on there. So that's also one reason why I think Tibet is timely. And then more specific to this topic, with all of the federal cuts that have happened recently and are ongoing, the funding from the State Department to Tibetan refugees in South Asia was cut in the early part of the Trump administration, but was restored, as you can see, over the summer. So again, there is still some efforts to support Tibetans in South Asia in terms of vocational training and things like that. And then also, there's a lot of talk these days about whether the United States is in a second Cold War with China specifically. And as you'll see today and may know already, Tibet was absolutely a thorn in China's side in the actual Cold War, and may still be again in terms of different sort of foreign support for the Tibetans. And then it's also a segue from my previous research. So as Scott mentioned, I wrote a book on the China-India border conflict in the 1950s and 1960s. And Tibet is so central to that. The Dalai Lama in 1959 escaping over the border. I just discovered recently in the archives here that, for example, that American Emergency Committee I mentioned for Tibetan refugees actually said that the war with China in 1962, India's war with China, was in a sense a good thing, because it shed more light on the plight of the Tibetans, and the committee was able to conduct their work in India more smoothly. And the other thing too, which I discovered, is that there were a number of Tibetan refugees who were evacuated from the Northeast Frontier Agency, one of the areas of the disputed border. So there were sort of double refugees in that sense. And then I guess the final point here is that well, as we'll go into this more in detail in terms of the significance of the border. But again, with Tibet being so central to it, I think that definitely made sense. So again, this is my recent book. The other point, again, this is the segue with previous research. This was an archival document I found from the Canadian archives, where the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, John Diefenbaker, was talking about how challenging it was to produce aid for Tibetans in these kind of valleys in the Himalayas because of geographical difficulties. But then he also goes on to say that that those particular areas are in international dispute. So again, that's another relation to the border conflict, that is it even viable or maybe legal to go into those areas. So I thought I would provide a little historical background for how this whole Tibetan refugee crisis began. And I won't dwell on this timeline too much, but essentially 1959 was the watershed moment for it, because this was when the Lhasa Uprising occurred and failed, and the Dalai Lama and so many other Tibetans, some 80,000, the numbers are not that precise, about 80,000 fled into India, into Nepal, into Bhutan, and some of the surrounding areas. And to trace the history back to this, many of you know that the Chinese entered Tibet in 1950 and had a level of control. Tibet was de facto independent from the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912 through 1950, essentially. So the Chinese communists exerted some degree of control. But in the years after, there were some uprisings. There was a sort of smallish rebellion in Kham in the eastern part of Tibet, 1956. And then in 1957, and in fact, some years earlier, different foreign governments were aiding the Tibetan rebels, CIA beginning in 1957 in my home state in Colorado at Camp Hale. They were doing some training activities and then parachuting the Tibetan rebels back into Tibet to harass Chinese military positions and things like that. So that's sort of the quick background. There was an incident in April of 1958 when the Chinese Communist Party was trying to, I guess you'd say, sedentarize the nomads and received a lot of pushback um, from them. And then finally, going into March of 1959, there were rumors about the Dalai Lama being kidnapped, and protests and mob violence beginning shortly after. The other point to make in terms of the Dalai Lama fleeing, which I will go into now, is that the Dalai Lama paid a visit to India in 1956 through early 1957, and of course was talking to the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru about the turmoil in Tibet, and was suggesting that maybe he would seek asylum in India. And at the time, Nehru encouraged him to return. In early 1957, encouraged him to return to Tibet, which he did, but then would flee these couple years later. And again, there's all sorts of reasons for why that was. This was also the era of what's known as a Hindi Chini Bye Bye, basically Hindi expression meaning India and China were brothers in the 1950s, and Nehru's efforts to not antagonize China, essentially, to put in a nutshell. So the Dalai Lama ends up escaping in March of '59, and again the relation to the border being that he crosses the controversial McMahon line, which was something that the Chinese government never acknowledged. The other point of this story, which I think a lot of people are not aware of, is that Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leader, was actually aware of the Dalai Lama's escape, and actually in these early into the escape, allowed him to go. That he, I guess, figured that if he had captured the Dalai Lama or the Dalai Lama were killed, it would just result in more protests and turmoil in Tibet. Mao later changes his mind, but by then it's too late, and the Dalai Lama is in India. So just a very quick tracing of where the Dalai Lama went. Crossing over the McMahon line is essentially this border between the gray and the white. The Dalai Lama ends up in the transit camp, essentially, of Tezpur in Assam, then ends up taking this train to Mussoorie, another major camp for the Tibetan refugees, and then ends up in Dharamsala, where he resides today. And again, many thousands of Tibetans followed this sort of basic route, ending up in one of these transit camps, and then maybe ending up in Himachal Pradesh in the Indian Northwest. So again, looking into these different thematic concepts, that of humanitarianism and international law. So in the aftermath of the failed Lhasa Uprising, the International Commission of Jurists produced a study, produced two reports actually, where they said, at least prima facie, based on the facts that they had collected, it was a genocide that had occurred in Tibet in terms of cultural destruction, imprisonment, large-scale killings, things like that. And so this produced a couple of problems. Again, even in the best of circumstances, international law is not so enforceable. But what complicated this situation was that the PRC never signed the Universal Declaration on Human Rights or the Genocide Convention, and of course during this time period, the PRC was not even a member of the United Nations. So that produced another set of complications. The second set of complications was, as this international law scholar pointed out at the time, that these reports had relied a lot on the testimonies of refugees who had their own sort of biases and agendas, perhaps, and that, as he says here, were prone to these natural exaggerations of refugees. So again, this was sort of the international legal framing of the Lhasa Uprising and its aftermath. So again, in terms of the aftermath of the Lhasa Uprising, the Dalai Lama made many appeals to all sorts of governments. This was just one example of a document I found in the Canadian archives, writing to the Canadian government, basically saying that although hundreds of Tibetans had escaped into Nepal and to India, there are still many more left in Tibet itself, and they, as he said, faced imminent death and destruction. And He was writing this letter specifically to John Diefenbaker, whom I mentioned a few times already, and, quote, begged him and his government to do all that was possible to help the unfortunate people of Tibet. So again, these were the sort of efforts that the Dalai Lama made personally, but then, of course, his representatives did as well. So again, there were earlier appeals to aid. This was a cable I found in the, or a summary of a cable I found in the Truman Library in 1949, when essentially the Chinese Civil War is wrapping up. The Chinese Communists had won. The People's Republic of China was declared in October of that year. And these Tibetans pointing out that the Chinese Communists had occupied Qinghai, the surrounding provinces, basically Qinghai, Xinjiang, again, very much in the news for the plight of Uyghurs there. I won't have time to go into. And then also the province of Xikang, which no longer exists, but is basically part of Sichuan province, what's now Sichuan province in eastern Tibet. So essentially the Tibetans were saying that they could see the writing on the wall, that there would be some sort of imminent invasion of Tibet, and they were appealing to the Truman administration to aid in some way, or at least have an audience with these two representatives from the Tibetan government in Washington, D.C. So the then Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, scuttled this idea, saying that this would produce complicated questions regarding the status and treatment of Tibet, and might actually hasten, as he would say, Chai Kami action against Tibet. What's also interesting is that when he made this statement in January 12th, 1950, that was the exact same date that he gave his famous perimeter line speech. For those of you who know, this was when Dean Acheson said that the US would not get involved in areas of Asia west of Japan, essentially, so leaving out Taiwan, leaving out Korea. Of course, the United States gets involved shortly thereafter in Korea, but Tibet being absolutely outside of this perimeter line. So kind of an interesting coincidence. Another question that I'm looking into and I haven't found an answer to, and again, would really appreciate assistance from anyone here or online, of course, is what the situation was like prior to 1959. Were there Tibetan refugees ending up in India and other places after that 1956 kind of small rebellion that I mentioned? I have not found sufficient documentary evidence. So again, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. This was a document I found in what's known as the Nebu Tankal, the internal reference materials of the Chinese Communist Party, where there was sort of a rumor that in 1955, Tibetans ended up in Burma and were requesting political asylum. If you read on this article, it said again that was just sort of a rumor, and the Burmese government absolutely denied it. So again, not sufficient evidence to say it happened, but I would be really interested if someone could shed some light on this. And again, I'm absolutely open to the fact that I have not looked in the right places, or perhaps have overlooked something. So also on the topic of rumors, so this is jumping ahead a little bit, but again, this is one of the transit camps, the many transit camps where Tibetan refugees ended up in India. Again, another place in Assam in the northeast. And the concern at the time, which we see in today's discourse regarding refugees and I think immigrants in general, is what is the vetting process? Who are these people? Why are they there? And so on and so forth. So this article from the Times of India talks about these discussions in the Indian parliament. People saying, if you see in the first paragraph, there are discussions of are the so-called Tibetan refugees actually pro-communist? Are they themselves Chinese? Are they pro-Chinese? Are they going to foment insurrection in India, especially in these sensitive areas? And so that was the question I asked: were they actually fifth columnists in disguise? And it was around this time, it was March 1959, when Nehru said that he would not grant political asylum to anyone without proper documentation, including the Tibetans. So again, this is a big concern. And this tug of war, again, looking at things like legality, refugee status, and trying to do something humane and help out what seem to be desperate people. So again, on this topic of humanitarianism, One of the big comparisons that was made at the time, and I think is worth looking into now, was that of the Hungarian uprising 3 years before that of the uprising in Tibet. So a lot of parallels there in the sense that they were people fighting, described at the time as freedom-loving people who were opposing an oppressive government, people who ended up becoming refugees, well, uprisings that ended up failing in both cases, and having a fairly brutal crackdown in the aftermath. And the other similarity was a lot of refugees ended up in the same countries in both cases, Australia, Canada, the United States, just to name a few examples. And I think the other thing worth pointing out was the fact that, again, people at the time were making these comparisons in terms of what they both could do to help the different groups of refugees and what were their limitations. So this was a quote I found from the Nehru Library. This was a discussion Nehru was having with the Dalai Lama, saying that there were troubles in Hungary. It aroused feelings and sympathy from the world, but you really still couldn't do anything except to help the refugees. And he would go on to state that if the Tibetans want to return to their homeland, the whole fabric of Chinese society has to be destroyed. It was just an impossibility otherwise. Just one other example on this comparison with Hungary was one of the major members of the American Emergency Committee for Tibetan Refugees, Marvin Liebman, who was basically a New York sort of conservative activist and businessman, was talking about how the Hungarians and Tibetans had a lot in common, again, in terms of their shared anti-communism. So the other point too to make is not just looking at the concept of humanitarianism, but how it ends up being tied into larger great power and Cold War politics. Again, mentioned a second ago with respect to having to accept some limitation in terms of India's efforts to help Tibetans out in Tibet proper. But this also being a statement, again, from the Canadian Prime Minister, talking about how the Indian government itself was kind of reluctant to have different international organizations and much less foreign governments be involved in India to help out with Tibetan refugees. And I think this gets back to a lot of complications with India as a fairly newly independent country, dealing with sort of the legacies of colonialism, having foreign intervention, and being kind of sensitive to that. And there are other aspects of this too I'll go into later on. But then also looking at it from the perspective of refugees coming to Canada, this was a statement from the Canadian Department of External Affairs saying that they would be willing to help the refugees, provided that it didn't create too much publicity and antagonize China too much. And this would really become more of an issue in the late 1960s when Canada was making a lot of efforts to build ties with communist China and essentially pushed for their admission to the UN again in those later years. And so the Tibetan issue was really a stumbling block that they had to navigate really carefully. And I think some of the language you see in the documents, not just in Canada, but for example, in Switzerland and Australia, other places, was that the Tibetans could come in, but there were fairly tight regulations on their political activities, that they could earn a living in their host countries, but not advocate Tibetan independence and things like that. So again, going into not just government support, but the involvement of the United Nations, as I alluded to in the previous slide, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was very much regulated within India, but nonetheless, they established a branch in Nepal in 1964 to deal with the Tibetan refugee crisis there, which by all accounts was worse than in India, I think, because of the relative poverty of Nepal and just their inability to deal with the Tibetan refugees in a systematic of a way. But nonetheless, the High Commission was involved in India as well, and again, in terms of collaborating with different international organizations, the Commission was involved with the Nepal Red Cross, again, local organizations, but as well as the Swiss government technical assistance agency. So there was a whole panoply of different places doing different kinds of work to help the Tibetans in South Asia. And again, the number of Tibetans in Nepal, not surprisingly, being a lot less than the 80,000 some that ended up mainly in India. Okay, good. The video didn't play yet. So anyway, the other issue, again, getting back to this idea of India regulating the UN activities in the country, was that the Indian government didn't want the UN High Commission for Refugees to be too involved, spending too much money because doing so could bring this issue in front of the General Assembly, and again, maybe too much scrutiny of India's activities, or just interference essentially in home affairs. So that was one reason why there was that regulation. Nonetheless, the High Commission was allowed to sell this record in 1963, the so-called All-Star Festival record. And I don't know if you can see it on the screen. I'll play it in a minute. But some major stars, Louis Armstrong, Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald. And the record sold worldwide and sold rather well. And I'm not exactly sure why it came out in this year, because it turns out that 1959 to 1960 was designated by the UN the Year of the Refugee. So again, not exactly sure why then, but it was successful. And let me just skip ahead for a moment. So the High Commissioner, the Swiss gentleman, Felix Schneider, also said that not only could the sales of the record in India be put toward helping the Tibetan refugees, but maybe some money could be siphoned off from the sale of the record in places like Western Europe and so forth. I haven't followed up to see if that's what actually happened, but he was very much in dialogue with the Indian government in this respect. So the other thing also to mention, again, in terms of this sort of complication regarding the United Nations and operations in South Asia, was this final point that neither Nepal nor India are signatories to 51 Convention relating to refugees, and also the 1960. Also, again, in terms of supporting religious reasons, were 8 efforts from this Quaker group based in Philadelphia, and also a state-level aid society based in Bombay. So it was really a transnational effort, and again, there was a surprising amount of cooperation between these various groups. And so just to talk a little bit more about the American Emergency Committee, whose papers I've been looking at the last few days. It was founded by Lowell Thomas, and he was a fairly well-known news broadcaster, and maybe best known because he filmed a lot of the footage of T.E. Lawrence, who was of course known as Lawrence of Arabia, and brought Lowell Thomas a lot of fame in that respect. Thomas went on a trip with his wife to Tibet in 1949. I'm not exactly clear why, but was really taken in with the place, and that became his cause for over a decade. And in terms of the work that the American Emergency Committee did, you can see this document I found where they talked about handicraft training for Tibetans in India, different vocational training. One of the largest items in their budget was dispensing medicine. They would get a lot of donations from Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies and ship it to India to give to the Tibetans. And then also another budget item that was fairly large was that of scholarships, both for study within India and then also abroad. There's a whole series of documents of Tibetans who ended up at Cornell, for example, financed mainly by the American Emergency Committee. I guess the final thing to point out too is there was a lot of construction projects. For example, there was a Walter Judd Hospital built in India to help the Tibetans, and also a Lowell Thomas house to house Tibetan orphans. And so there was similarly an American house. I think there was some competition with different foreign aid groups. There was a British house, so there had to be an American house, and things like that. So these were the various activities they were doing. The other thing, just to note as an aside, was that their funding really peaked in 1959, 1960, and went down quite precipitously through 1969, 1970. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think maybe one tragic reason is that, as we see today, refugees can be sort of a flavor of the month, that everyone was talking about. Tibetans during this time period, and then into the 1960s, there were refugees from Vietnam, and that took the spotlight and so forth. So again, kind of the news cycle, I guess, is to blame. Then also, I found it interesting that there were a number of business interests that were coordinating to help out, or at least admit Tibetans to their various home countries. This was a letter from the Manitoba Beet Growers Association, basically saying that the Tibetans would be helpful laborers in Canada. And so, I mean, maybe there was a humanitarian dimension, but also a profit motive. So that was also kind of unexpected to me. Same thing happened in Switzerland. Different discussions about how the Tibetan refugees could work for various corporations, how they could be farmhands, or as they would just say, help out in the Alps. I don't know exactly what that means. But this idea that the Tibetans and Swiss had a lot in common as mountain peoples, and that there was some natural affinity between the two groups. Someone who was pretty opposed to this and was quite cynical about it was the then Swiss ambassador to India, Jacques Coutat, who was saying that the idea of bringing the Tibetans to Switzerland had more to do with their benefactors and maybe some Swiss fantasy toward Tibet than actually than it did the Tibetan refugees themselves. And so this was just a paragraph I extracted where he was saying that an example of the sort of mismatch here was the fact that there were Tibetans who ended up leaving different camps in Nepal, and that this was an example of their aversion to sedentary life, that they just really wanted to adapt to life in Switzerland. And that people have these sort of illusions of employing them as laborers and farmhands that again are just unfeasible, and that the Tibetans were best served remaining in South Asia. Again, more to talk about there in a minute. So let's see, how am I doing in time? In terms of moral support, again, in this research, I try to look at the policies of different governments and different groups, but also just looking at individuals. So as far as I know, George Woodcock was not involved much with the Canadian government, other than writing letters saying that the government should do more to help out the Tibetans. He was a somewhat radical professor who ended up as a conscientious objector during, I think it was the Second World War, and also, again, someone who was taken in by the Tibetan cause. Conducted a lot of interviews with the Dalai Lama, and then founded his own Tibetan Refugee Aid Society in 1962. And then again, a statement from him in terms of the moral dimension of helping the Tibetans, saying that there's only so much the Indian government can do, only so much civil society can do, but it's really a burden on the, as he would phrase it, the prosperous countries of the world to become more involved in helping out the Tibet refugees. Again, looking at from a very moral point of view. Again, there were a number of sort of resettlement problems. This was a statement by a woman who was married to a medical doctor who was living in Dharamsala in the 1970s, saying that the Tibetan refugees in India, at least the younger and more ambitious ones, really wanted to go abroad, and they felt kind of stuck there, and were very much a stranger in a strange land. So, kind of the opposite of what Jacques Coutat was saying. But nonetheless, there was also this larger question of geographical suitability and I guess I would say like essentialist descriptions of the Tibetans, that they are mountain people, so they belong in the mountains. But it wasn't just foreigners who were saying this. There were Tibetan leaders saying that too, that the climate really made a big difference, saying that this was from the Australian Ministry of External Affairs, saying that the Tibetans really couldn't be properly resettled in tropical areas. And Nehru said the same thing. That they couldn't live in lower elevations. And then this was also sort of a harebrained scheme that the Canadian government considered briefly, of taking in Tibetan refugees and settling them in the Northern Territories, and basically having them be yak farmers there. And there were a lot of studies on this saying it really wasn't feasible. But again, the geographical suitability being a major problem. Chinese reactions, I won't go into this in too much depth, but just a parallel today with people, with the Chinese Foreign Ministry saying that aid to Tibetan refugees is nonetheless an affront to China because it's interference in Chinese internal affairs. Again, some examples from the time period, the Chinese government using similar language to refer to the refugees as Tibetan bandits, and so forth. Again, this larger question of, were they actually refugees or were they up to something else? Same language here in correspondence with the Canadian government by a Chinese official. So in terms of Tibetan refugees today, that's an ongoing issue in the sense that they have this kind of ambiguous status. Those of you, some of you may not know that India really doesn't have a refugee category per se, that you are a foreigner or you're a citizen, and there are protected groups such as the Tibetans. So it is this kind of ambiguous category. Then there's also the fact that with Tibet, as described by the US Congress in 1959 as a captive nation, that the Tibetans are, again, in this kind of awkward position of ruling from abroad and so forth, governing from abroad and waiting to hopefully return to their homeland. And this is a larger question I ask here, which is how unique was the Tibetan case? I mean, is it fair to make these comparisons with the Hungarians? Are there other refugee groups that it's worth comparing them to, or again, is it just a very typical refugee story that we see again and again? I guess I'll close with with something maybe more positive, but deals with nonetheless the Tibetans' status in India, which was going back to this woman Grania Davis I mentioned a short time ago. She essentially did this sort of amateur anthropology project of interviewing 100 Tibetan refugees in Himachal Pradesh, and one of the themes she picked up on was the fact that a lot of the Tibetans were actually sort of happy in the sense that they were living near their favorite Rinpoche or abbot, incarnate Lama, however you want to translate it, and that he was the source for all their contentment. And in a similar vein, the Canadian government basically said that it was their understanding that Tibetans prefer to remain as close as possible to their homeland. So I was just in Dharamshala, as I mentioned, doing some research at the Tibetan Library, and I'm not an anthropologist, but just talking to Tibetans there, a lot of them were pretty reluctant to become Indian citizens because it's sort of an identity issue. And not only that, but it is sort of a political problem, because if they were to become Indian citizens, they give up their claim on Tibet. So it's again this sort of I guess you could say grievance or philosophy of the Tibetan government in exile, which remains to this day. So I think that's pretty much what I have today, and I'm happy to take questions. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you. I'm going to take the chair's advantage to make a comment and ask a question, then we'll open it up. And I would ask everybody to identify yourself and your affiliation for our speaker. Comment is I think you've got to go more into the concert and all-star, not only because it's cool to be able to play that, but I've always thought like the concert of Bangladesh with George Harrison was the first time that that you had this experience. You're showing that this is a much older phenomenon, and you said, well, they wanted to siphon off money from other countries. Well, I don't know if siphon's the right word, but the idea that there's an international record being done through the UN, and where does the money go, and for whom? I think it's a fascinating story. It could be a neat article by in and of itself. My question has more to do with India, however. I mean, we know from other experiences that refugees, or in the case of Chinese workers in India after the invasion or the clash in '62, were very maltreated. There's relatively little. You had that one slide about negative reactions, but you didn't say much about it. What can you find out about Indian popular or local support or opposition?
Yeah, I probably should have gone into that in more detail. So I happened to see a few documents, again, from the American Emergency Committee records, and there was all sorts of speculation and maybe quite a bit of truth to the fact that a lot of locals resented the fact that this new hospital was built for the Tibetans and not for them, for example, or the fact that a lot of the Tibetans received cash assistance and didn't work. And again, there was especially the lamas had no interest in working. They were just studying and had studied their whole lives. So that produced a lot of tension, actually. And again, I think in India today there are plenty of Tibetans who are not that well integrated. There's a part of larger Delhi area named called Majnu Katila, which has a large Tibetan population. I guess it's referred to as a colony, a Tibetan colony, and I think plenty of people there speak Hindi, speak English, but I mean, maybe others don't, and they have their own kind of community. So,
but I don't think you can read too much into it being called a colony, because that's
right.
it's just the common phrase. Yeah, but it is interesting. Dipin first, and then Shumit second.
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Dipin. I'm a fellow here. We just met earlier today. I had two questions, and they're not in any way shortcomings of your work. It is more the curiosity that it kind of brings up in me. One, I was wondering whether the Indian hesitation about the UNHCR has to also do with the Kashmir dispute that was not very long ago for India. So the UN decision on Kashmir right after independence, pretty much a couple of years after, is taken as a personal affront by the Indian establishment and is kind of seen as a, reason to distance themselves from the UN. So is this, could that be in any way one geopolitical possible reason that could be playing out, especially since you spent some time on talking about why not the UN for India? And the second, this is kind of transitioning into the work that you do in your book. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about how the Tibet issue featured in the decision to go to war between India and China in 1962?
Oh, sure. Thanks. Those are good questions. I think I think it's a little bit hard to draw some like overarching conclusion about India's view toward the UN because during the same time period, India was kind of awkwardly petitioning the UN for China's admission, Beijing's admission to the UN. So I don't feel that India totally gave up on it, but I mean this idea of the Kashmir decision being a personal affront makes sense, and I hadn't thought about it, to be honest. So I probably should look into it to a larger degree. And in terms of Tibet's relation to the decision to go to war in 1962, again, I think it's so much to do with the geography in the sense that what today is known as Arunachal Pradesh, the Chinese still refer to as South Tibet. So, and people there speaking, different, I guess you could say, like languages that have Tibetan roots and so forth. So yeah, I think that was certainly an issue. Again, the McMahon Line, which I mentioned earlier, came into effect at the 1914 Shimla Conference, which was a trilateral conference including the Tibetans, the British, and Chinese. And essentially, the McMahon Line was agreed upon by the Tibetans and the British, but not the Chinese, and these were sort of secret negotiations. So again, there was all this kind of imperial history that was carried forward. Of course, the British being up to whatever they were up to, but then also the Qing dynasty laying claim to Tibet, which was not always the case in Chinese history. So it's really central, I would say.
Shumit,
Three quick reactions.
introduce yourself first.
Sorry. I'm Shumit Ganguly. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution next door. Three quick reactions to not so much questions. First, to follow up on the remark that was just made about India's reaction to the refugee issue, it had much to do with partition. Millions of people fled to India, and consequently, India didn't want to touch that can of worms of granting refugee status, because then you provide a legal basis for more people to move to India. And that was a very important factor. Second, a minor correction. The Chinese did sign the Shimla Convention. They went back to Beijing and then repudiated it.
I think they initialed it. They didn't sign it. Is that correct?
They initialed it at the conference, and then went back and they said, no, we're not going to abide by this.
I suppose that's true in the sense that they basically blamed their representative.
Right, they blamed, they
Yeah.
blamed the representative.
Initialed by the negotiator, but not by the government.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And that remains a controversy. The third thing is, I don't know if you've run across the work of a friend of mine who's no more, who is a Berkeley PhD and a Tibetan, Dawa Norbu,
Yeah, sure.
Red Star over Tibet. And I think Dawa's papers are at Jawaharlal Nehru University.
I wasn't aware of that.
He died in on time.
2006 or something.
Yeah. But I spoke to him at length about Tibet and just had granular knowledge.
In fact, I wasn't aware his papers were there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure his papers are there, and it's well worth looking into. And I don't know if the Indian IB chief's papers, B.N. Malik's papers, are open yet.
I don't think so.
They would be in the Nehru Memorial Library and Museum.
I tried to get them in 2016, and but it is a while ago. So
yeah. And Krishna Menon's papers are now open.
That's true. Yeah,
that's it.
That's great. Thank you.
Two questions from the online audience. One from an anonymous attendee. How you describe different efforts from Canada, U.S., Europe, etc. Is this all done independently, or is someone orchestrating this? And how do you tie them together? Or don't?
Yeah. I mean, I guess at the level of civil society, I mean, there were just these different aid groups that sprung up in different places, and they got in touch and would talk about what efforts they were making. And as I said, there was almost like a bit of competition with respect to some British aid group constructing an orphanage in a Tibetan camp, and then the Americans saying, "Oh, we ought to do the same thing." So I think it was sort of spontaneous in that regard. At the government level, again, I think there were cases of it. I mentioned this idea of Commonwealth solidarity. I mean, the Australians coordinating with the Canadians, and again saying we should help out a fellow Commonwealth member, India. So I think there were definitely instances of it, but I'm not sure I can say, it was a vast effort to coordinate everything on the government level. So
okay, and then another question from my brother, John Sagan, who happens to be
now I'm nervous.
Which says that he believes Nepal has a Tibetan population, and that Dianne Feinstein's husband, Richard Bloom, was active in raising money to support their cause next day in Nepal. I didn't know that.
I didn't know.
It'd be worth looking into. Does Nepal provide support for the Tibetan residents?
Dr. Chervin, I really enjoyed your talk. My name is Dean Winslow. I'm professor of medicine and pediatrics and I guess a courtesy fellow here at CSAC. And first of all, I really enjoyed your talk. I actually just kind of a quick comment. I'm obviously many years older than you. My one theory I have about why the Tibetans overall were welcomed, with open arms, US, Canada, Australia, UK, is there was a novel that was published by James Hilton in 1933 called Lost Horizon. And then Frank Capra, the amazing director and producer, made a movie out of it in 1937, which, was just absolutely, wonderfully reviewed. And it was re-released, I think, in the 1950s, just before this happened. And again, presumably Tibetans, and they were portrayed as just these absolutely angelic human beings. And so I honestly think that was probably a big part of why they were welcomed rather, than the way we treat, refugees from Central America and in US. So.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, and I think I think there is sort of an element of maybe whitewashing or sort of propaganda to it, in the sense that, as the Chinese government likes to point out a lot, traditional Tibetan society was extremely hierarchical, and there's questions of, did they have serfdom there and so forth, which may not have been included in some of these works. Another book that I think came out in the 50s was called The Rose of Tibet. I haven't read it, but I think there was a lot of literature that kind of captivated sort of Western minds.
Changes people's views about refugees, but also having novels written and creating a different image.
Hi, I'm Follow. I first is going back to the Indian, because I too had the same reaction of there's India in this story. I've been doing some research on Indian political parties and their ideology during the 1950s to the 1970s, and the BJP, well, the former iteration of the BJP, was very vocal in its support of Tibet. Actually included it in many of their electoral manifestos, but the ruling party did not include it. Didn't really seem to emphasize it or want to get involved. And even today, the BJP is vocal in the support of Tibet, but people accuse Modi of doing that for strategic reasons, to get at China and irritate them. So do you think that I guess first, what do you have to say about like the Indian domestic politics surrounding Tibet? And also, do you think that the Indian domestic politics is more geopolitical or ideological in nature? And I had a question about comparing the Indian assistance for the Tibetan refugees to the Indian assistance for the Bangladeshi refugees in 71, which my understanding is that they did a lot more spearheading of the international assistance effort, and were much more of a figurehead in that. So I was just curious if you had thought about that comparison.
Yeah, these are good questions. I mean, I have to agree with you based on the documents I've seen. I mean, different. I guess you could just say right-wing parties in India were definitely pro-Tibetan in their outlook. And I heard an interview recently with Nirupama Rao, the former Indian ambassador to China, who basically said that where things went wrong was when Nehru said that, okay, Tibet is part of China, and then and sort of accepted Chinese claims on Tibet. That had he opposed that, maybe I don't know if war in 1962 wouldn't have happened, but that, essentially Rao was saying that's where things went wrong. That And why, I think part of your question was like why these different political parties supported Tibet, whether it was geopolitical or so on. And I think, of course, there's a geopolitical dimension to it, but I think a big dimension is cultural. I mean, so much of Tibetan culture hails from India, diffusion of Buddhism and so on. So I think that really can't be overlooked. The Bangladeshi refugee crisis, I really haven't looked into as much as I should, but I think I really should do a comparison with other refugee groups, and I don't have much to say on that, unfortunately. So, but just as a follow-up, so were you suggesting that the Indian government was more active on that front in terms of dealing with refugees than the Tibetan refugee issue, or?
I mean, I haven't done research into the Tibet. You would know the Tibet case more, but I've studied the Bangladesh case, and they were very active. Gandhi wrote like personalized letters to every.
I think it's a numbers game too. I mean, I would imagine there were many more Bangladeshi refugees than
9.8 million.
Yeah, that makes sense.
9.8 million compared to 800,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I said the number I saw was 80,000, but
Yeah, sorry.
But that number varies. I mean, this
Your two finger?
No, I'd like to.
Let him finish. There you go.
Okay.
sorry, I was
Yeah.
just going to go back. If I can go quickly to the slide. There was a book I mentioned on Switzerland during the Cold War, and this scholar cites a number of 700,000 Tibetan refugees, which is the highest I've seen. So I don't know if that was an error. Maybe she meant 70,000 of this book here, but it hovers around 80,000, 86, something like that. So, but anyway,
Two finger from Schumett and then Rob.
It's not just right-wing parties in India. The Socialist Party in India, particularly led by George Fernandez, was a staunch cuts across ideological lines. And the Socialist Party had very little to lose because they were fairly small, and they were genuinely committed to a vision of democratic socialism, unlike the communists in India, who were quite craven and quite genuflecting before the Chinese, until the Sino-Soviet split took place, and then all manner of complications ensued.
There's ways of different connection to draw. Secondly, far be it for me to throw another archive onto your itinerary, but might there be something interesting in Taipei? If you cite Walter Judd, I mean, maybe he's in some dialogue with the ROC about all this, and maybe Chiang Kai-shek has developed an interest in Tibet.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I mean, what I didn't say in this, I don't know, project is I'm also looking or have gathered documents on foreign support for Tibetan resistance fighters, and Taiwan played a major role in that. And I have done already some going back to Dippen's question of Tibet's sort of linkage with my previous work. My first book did include documents and maps from Academia Historica in Taipei, showing these flight paths from both Taipei and also places in Southeast Asia into Tibet, where the Kuomintang, supported the Tibetans. So yeah, that's absolutely right. The other thing too, which I would love to do, is the nephew of Jello Tundup, who was a major figure involved with the CIA, lives in Taipei. So it might be good to interview him. So yeah, that's on my agenda. Yeah.
The Hoover catalog seems to be expanding dramatically from month to month with ROC materials.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah.
We still have time, and unless somebody else has a question, I wanted to open up a line of inquiry, I guess would be the way of putting it. This week has been an unusual week here at CSAC because we've had an anthropologist and a historian. talking. No political scientists this week, which is the political scientists are saying that's good. I know, and I'm just you came from an institution at the Naval War College that has lots of political scientists as well. Can you say something about sort of methods and how comparative you think this work should be? You made a couple of references to this is similar, different from what we have today in this particular case.
Yep.
How much do you want to do that in your work, and would that be helpful?
It probably would. I mean, so my previous department at the War College was the Department of Strategy and Policy, and it was essentially a 50-50 split, half historians, half political scientists, and
Unusual.
we sort of got along. Yeah, and so I think that whether I liked it or not, I got exposed to a lot of IR theory, and so I feel that if I were to integrate another sort of method, it would be maybe that, in the sense of, what was I don't know, maybe what was the underlying motivation for how countries engage with the Tibetans. I haven't thought that through a lot, but
more on the politics of Cold War, anti-China.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And would that help as a historian in publishing because you get a wider audience, or would that hurt because you're crossing into another domain?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it depends on the journal. I mean, I think maybe depending on how I frame this, it could be a matter of security studies. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there probably is like a whole literature on migration and refugee studies that I haven't.
There are journals on migration.
I haven't really delved into, but I probably should. So,
yeah, I mean, they're very specialized journals, but nonetheless, it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Any last questions?
Very last suggestion for you, since Dipin brought up, I think Dipin or maybe Emily brought up 1971. One of you did. Okay, Emily did. Okay. The best place to start is Gary Bass's book, The Blood Telegram.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
I mean, it is extraordinarily well researched.
And beautifully written.
And beautifully written. And he gets every detail right.
Using mainly what sources?
Oh, he uses Indian sources. He uses American sources. I mean, it's almost a flawless account.
That's right. Yeah.
And he gets into the internal debates in India about what do we do now? And there are some people saying, look, we can't take the refugees. This is too much of a burden. But then they face domestic pressures, and people say these are our sort of compatriots. We can't be oblivious to their plight. It is almost a flawless book.
And sorry, what was the author's name?
Gary Bass. He's at Princeton.
Okay, thanks.
And he's just written a book on the Tokyo war crimes trial, where an Indian judge played a vital role, Justice Radha Vinod Pal.
Yeah, thanks. I'm of course aware of the Blood Telegram, but
and it's named after
Archer Blood.
Archer Blood, who was courageous enough to dissent from Nixon and Kissinger.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, Blood's papers are in Fort Collins, Colorado, something like that.
Or somewhere in Pennsylvania.
Oh, are they? Okay. Yeah. Okay. He had a Colorado connection, so that was just
retired in the area.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking.
So great questions. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah.